Why is it that some people keep moving forward, yet something always pulls them back? Why do opportunities appear, but disappear at the edge of breakthrough? Why do certain seasons feel like you are running, but not arriving? What if the issue is not effort, but access? Because sometimes life is not blocked because nothing is available. It is blocked because something is holding what belongs to you. And if you only focus on trying harder, you may never address what is actually restricting you. There is a difference between lack and withheld blessing. There is a difference between delay and resistance. There is a difference between effort and authority. And if you cannot tell the difference, you may keep exhausting yourself fighting the wrong battle. Because not every delay is natural. Not every limitation is normal. Not every repeated struggle is accidental. Some things repeat because they are being reinforced. Some doors remain closed because something is standing against them. Some progress slows down, not because you are incapable, but because something is interfering. And this is where awareness must begin. Not fear, but clarity. Because once you begin to understand that life is not always neutral, you start asking different questions. Why does this pattern keep returning? Why does this same struggle appear in different forms? Why does progress stop at the same point? And when those questions are asked honestly, you begin to move beyond symptoms into roots. Because symptoms are visible, but roots are hidden. Symptoms are what you feel. Roots are what sustain the problem. And if the root is not addressed, the cycle continues. This is why prayer is not meant to be casual. It is not meant to be routine. It is not meant to be passive. Prayer is meant to be intentional engagement. Not just asking, but confronting. Not just speaking, but aligning. Not just hoping, but addressing. Because when something has been holding what belongs to you, there must be a moment where you stop negotiating with it. You stop tolerating it. You stop adjusting to it. And you begin to confront it. Not emotionally, but with clarity. Because frustration without understanding leads to exhaustion. But clarity produces direction. And direction produces effective action. Now, here is something deeper. Because many people are waiting for a perfect moment to change things. They are waiting until they feel ready. They are waiting until circumstances improve. They are waiting until everything aligns. But what if that moment never comes? What if waiting is part of the delay? Because there are times when change does not begin with comfort. It begins with decision. A decision that something must not continue. A decision that a pattern must end. A decision that what has been withheld must be released. And this kind of decision is not passive. It is intentional. It is focused. It is grounded. Because you are no longer observing your situation, you are engaging it. And this is where a shift begins. Not always visible at first, but real. Because something happens when awareness meets action. You stop reacting and you start responding. You stop being overwhelmed and you begin to take position. And this is critical because position determines outcome. If you remain passive, you remain affected. If you remain unaware, you remain vulnerable. But when you become intentional, you begin to change the dynamic. And this is where many people misunderstand spiritual engagement. They think it is about intensity alone, but intensity without understanding is unstable. Real engagement requires awareness, clarity, consistency. Because one moment of intensity cannot undo a long pattern of neglect, but consistent alignment can. And this is why this moment matters. Because you are not just listening, you are recognizing that some things must be addressed directly, recognizing that some patterns must be broken intentionally, recognizing that some delays must not be accepted as normal. And once that recognition settles, you cannot go back to ignorance. You cannot pretend you do not see it. You cannot ignore what has become clear. And this is where responsibility begins. Not pressure, but responsibility. Because once you see clearly, you must choose what to do with that clarity. Will you ignore it? Will you delay again? Or will you act? Because action is what separates awareness from transformation. And this is where the concept of recovery becomes important. Not just recovery as a feeling, but recovery as a process. Because if something has been delayed, blocked, or lost, it must be reclaimed. Not emotionally, but intentionally. And this is where many people struggle, because they think recovery should be automatic. But recovery often requires engagement. You must identify what has been affected. You must understand what has been holding it. You must align yourself correctly, and then you must act. Not once, but consistently. Because consistency is what breaks cycles, and cycles do not break easily. They resist, they repeat, they reinforce themselves, but they can be broken, not by chance, but by clarity, alignment, and persistent action. And this is the beginning, not the end. Because what you are stepping into is not just a moment of change, but a process of transformation. A process where patterns are exposed, roots are confronted, delays are challenged, and alignment is restored. But this process requires something from you, not perfection, but participation, not emotion, but commitment, not noise, but understanding. Because transformation does not happen around you, it happens through you. And this is where everything begins to shift. There is a pattern that many people overlook. They notice what is missing, but they do not investigate why it is missing. They feel delay, but they do not question what is sustaining the delay. They experience resistance, but they assume it is just part of life. And because of that, they adjust to what should have been confronted. But there is a difference between enduring a process and being trapped in a pattern. A process leads somewhere, a pattern keeps you in the same place. And if you are honest, some things are not just slow, they are repeating. Opportunities come, then disappear. Progress begins, then resets. Momentum builds, then collapses. And after a while, it starts to feel normal. But what if it is not normal? What if something is interfering with continuity? Because progress is not only about starting, it is about sustaining. And when something consistently interrupts your progress, you must ask, is this random or is this reinforced? Because there are forces that do not need to stop you completely. They only need to slow you down. They only need to distract you. They only need to delay you long enough for you to lose momentum. And once momentum is lost, many people never restart. Not because they cannot, but because they are tired. And this is how cycles continue. Not always through strong resistance, but through consistent interruption. This is why you must begin to pay attention to patterns, not just events, patterns. Because events can mislead you, but patterns reveal truth. And when you begin to observe carefully, you start to notice things like, why do I always stop at this stage? Why do I always lose focus at this point? Why does this same kind of problem return in different forms? And once you begin to see it clearly, you can no longer dismiss it. Because recognition removes excuses. And this is where responsibility becomes unavoidable. Not because you cause everything, but because you must respond to what you now see. And this response must be different from before, because repeating the same approach will produce the same result. You cannot confront a persistent issue with inconsistent effort. You cannot break a cycle with occasional attention. You cannot change a pattern while maintaining the habits that created it. Something must shift, and that shift begins internally. Because before anything changes externally, alignment must occur internally. Your thinking must change. Your awareness must increase. Your response must become intentional, because internal alignment determines external direction. If your thinking is scattered, your actions will be inconsistent. If your awareness is low, your decisions will be reactive. If your response is passive, your situation will remain unchanged. But when alignment begins, everything starts to stabilize. You begin to recognize distractions faster. You begin to respond with clarity instead of emotion. You begin to maintain direction even under pressure. And this is where real progress begins. Not in sudden breakthroughs, but in sustained movement. Because lasting change is not built on moments. It is built on patterns. Healthy patterns. Consistent patterns. Intentional patterns. And this is where discipline becomes necessary. Not as restriction, but as structure. Because without structure, everything becomes unstable. And instability invites interruption. This is why discipline protects progress. It keeps you moving even when motivation fades. It keeps you focused even when distractions increase. It keeps you aligned even when pressure rises. And over time, this consistency begins to break old cycles, not instantly, but steadily. And this steady movement is powerful because it cannot be easily disrupted. It does not depend on emotion. It does not depend on circumstances. It is anchored in decision. And this is what changes outcomes. Because when your response becomes consistent, patterns begin to lose their control. What used to stop you no longer has the same effect. What used to delay you no longer carries the same weight. What used to distract you no longer pulls you away. Not because everything has disappeared, but because you have changed. And this is a critical shift. Because transformation is not only about removing obstacles, it is about becoming someone who is no longer controlled by them. And this requires awareness, continuous awareness. Because patterns do not always disappear completely. Sometimes they attempt to return. Sometimes they appear in new forms. Sometimes they test your consistency. But now, you are no longer unaware. You recognize the signs. You see the early stages. You respond before it grows. And this is what sustains change. Not reacting late, but responding early. Because early response prevents escalation. And prevention is often more powerful than recovery. But many people only respond when things become serious. And by then, the pattern has already gained strength. This is why awareness must remain active, not occasional, but continuous. Because consistency in awareness leads to consistency in action. And consistency in action produces stability. And stability creates progress. Not temporary progress, but lasting movement. And this is where you begin to step into a different kind of life. Not one controlled by repetition, but one guided by clarity. Not one defined by delay, but one shaped by direction. Not one influenced by confusion, but one grounded in understanding. And this shift is not dramatic, but it is powerful. Because it changes how you live, how you decide, how you respond, and ultimately how you move forward. Because now, you are not just reacting to life, you are engaging it intentionally. And that changes everything. There's something deeper that must be confronted now, because not every delay is maintained from the outside. Some patterns are sustained from within, not intentionally, not consciously, but consistently. And this is where many people struggle to go further, because it is easier to confront what is outside than to examine what is inside. It is easier to blame circumstances than to question internal alignment. But if transformation must be complete, nothing can be ignored, because sometimes what you are fighting externally is being reinforced internally. And this is not about guilt, it is about clarity, because clarity exposes what must change. Now ask yourself honestly, are there thoughts you have allowed to remain that weaken your direction? Are there habits you keep repeating that quietly slow you down? Are there responses you have normalized that keep recreating the same outcome? Because patterns do not sustain themselves randomly. They are maintained through repetition, through agreement, through tolerance, and sometimes through lack of awareness. This is why internal alignment is critical, because if your internal state contradicts your intention, your progress will always be unstable. You may move forward, but something will keep pulling you back, not because you are incapable, but because you are divided. And division creates inconsistency. You want change, but part of your thinking resists it. You desire progress, but your habits are not aligned with it. You expect different results, but your response remains the same. And this creates a loop, a cycle that feels like movement, but produces repetition. This is why honesty is necessary. Not surface level honesty, but deep, uncomfortable honesty. The kind that asks, what am I still aligned that I should have removed? What am I tolerating that is weakening my progress? What am I repeating that is reinforcing the problem? Because until these questions are answered, true change cannot happen. You can continue to push forward, but the results will remain inconsistent. And inconsistency leads to frustration, not because you are not trying, but because something is misaligned. This is where correction begins, not through pressure, but through adjustment. You begin to realign your thinking, you begin to interrupt old patterns, you begin to change how you respond, not occasionally, but intentionally. Because intentional change creates new patterns, and new patterns produce new outcomes. But here is the challenge. Because internal change is not immediate. It requires discipline. It requires awareness. It requires repetition. And this is where many people stop. Because they expect change to feel easy. They expect it to happen quickly. They expect it to remain without effort. But real alignment takes consistency. You must reinforce it daily. You must maintain it intentionally. You must protect it carefully, because anything not maintained will eventually weaken. And when it weakens, old patterns try to return. Not aggressively, but subtly. Through small compromises, through slight distractions, through quiet neglect. And if you are not paying attention, you may not notice it immediately until the pattern begins again. This is why vigilance matters. Not fear, but awareness. Because awareness allows you to respond early, before the pattern grows, before the delay returns, before the cycle repeats. And this is where maturity begins. Not in avoiding challenges, but in recognizing them quickly. Not in reacting emotionally, but in responding intentionally. Not in hoping things change, but in maintaining alignment. And this is what strengthens you. Not dramatic movement, but consistent awareness. Because over time, this awareness becomes natural. You no longer need to force it. You recognize patterns instantly. You adjust quickly. You stay aligned. And this creates stability. Not temporary stability, but sustained strength. But there is another layer. Because internal alignment is not only about removing what is wrong, it is about strengthening what is right. You do not only stop harmful patterns, you build healthy ones. You do not only reject distraction, you develop focus. You do not only avoid delay, you cultivate discipline. And this is what completes the process, because removing something without replacing it creates emptiness, and emptiness invites old patterns back. This is why replacement is necessary. You replace confusion with clarity. You replace passivity with intentional action. You replace inconsistency with structure. And over time, this becomes your new normal. Not forced, but natural. And this is where transformation becomes visible. Not in one moment, but in how you live, how you think, how you respond, how you move forward. Because now you are no longer repeating cycles, you are building direction. And direction produces results, not instantly, but steadily. And steady progress is powerful because it cannot be easily reversed. But even with this understanding, there is still something else that must be addressed. Because external resistance does not disappear simply because internal alignment begins. There are still pressures, there are still challenges, there are still forces that will try to interrupt your progress. And this is where strength must develop. Not reactive strength, but grounded strength. The kind that remains under pressure. The kind that continues without confusion. The kind that does not collapse when resistance appears. Because this is what sustains everything. Without strength, alignment fades. Without strength, consistency breaks. Without strength, progress slows down. And this is why the next step is critical. Because awareness has begun. Alignment has started. But now, you must learn how to stand. There comes a point where awareness is no longer enough. You have seen the pattern. You have recognized the cycle. You have started adjusting your thinking. But now, something else is required. The ability to stand. Because once you begin to change, resistance becomes more intentional. Not always louder, but more targeted. Distractions become more appealing. Pressure becomes more consistent. Old patterns try to return with subtle force. And if you are not stable, you will be pulled back into what you already understood. This is why standing is not passive. It is active stability. It is the ability to remain aligned even when everything around you is trying to shift you. Because movement without stability is dangerous. You may start strong, but you will not sustain. And sustainability is what determines outcome. Now here is something many people misunderstand. They think standing means doing nothing. But real standing is not inactivity. It is controlled persistence. You are still moving forward, but you are not easily shaken. You are still progressing, but you are not easily distracted. You are still engaged, but you are not reacting to everything. And this is where strength begins to show. Not in intensity, but in consistency under pressure. Because anyone can act when things feel easy, but it takes strength to remain steady when things feel uncertain. And this is where many people fall. Not because they lack knowledge, but because they lack stability. They know what to do, but they do not sustain it. They understand the pattern, but they do not hold their position. They start the process, but they do not continue through resistance. And this is why standing must be developed intentionally, not by accident, not by emotion, but by decision. You decide to remain aligned. You decide to continue forward. You decide not to return to what you have already outgrown. And this decision must be repeated, not once, but consistently. Because pressure does not come once. It comes in waves. And each wave tests your stability, not to destroy you, but to reveal your foundation. Because whatever is not stable will be exposed under pressure. And this is where truth becomes clear. If your alignment is based on feeling, it will shift. If your consistency is based on motivation, it will fade. If your direction is based on circumstances, it will change. But if your foundation is grounded, you will remain. And this is the goal. Not temporary strength, but stable strength. The kind that does not collapse when challenged. The kind that does not panic when delayed. The kind that does not retreat when pressured. And this strength is built over time, through repetition, through discipline, through continued alignment. But here is something deeper. Because standing is not only about resisting what is wrong, it is also about holding what is right. You are not just avoiding old patterns, you are maintaining new direction. You are not just rejecting distraction, you are protecting focus. You are not just resisting delay, you are sustaining progress. And this is where intentional living begins. Because now, you are not reacting to life, you are directing it. Not controlling everything, but choosing your response. And your response determines your outcome. But even with strength, there is still something that must be understood. Because resistance is not always obvious. Sometimes it appears as fatigue. Sometimes it appears as discouragement. Sometimes it appears as distraction. And if you misinterpret it, you may respond incorrectly. You may think you need to stop when you actually need to continue. You may think you need to change direction when you actually need to stay consistent. You may think nothing is working when something is already shifting. And this is why discernment matters. Not just awareness, but accurate interpretation. Because what you think is happening influences how you respond. And how you respond determines what happens next. This is why you must remain clear, not rushed, not reactive, not overwhelmed, but clear. You evaluate your situation correctly. You recognize patterns accurately. You respond intentionally. And this clarity protects your progress, because confusion leads to wrong decisions, and wrong decisions lead to setbacks. But clarity maintains direction, and direction sustains movement. Now, here is the turning point, because if you continue to stand, something begins to change. Not immediately, but gradually. The resistance that once felt strong begins to weaken. The pattern that once repeated begins to break. The delay that once held you begins to shift. And this is where many people make a mistake. They stop too early. They relax too soon. They assume the battle is over when the process is not yet complete. And this is dangerous, because incomplete persistence leads to incomplete results. And incomplete results often return to old patterns. This is why you must continue, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Because you are not just trying to start something, you are finishing it. You are not just interrupting a pattern, you are ending it. You are not just moving forward, you are establishing a new direction. And this requires completion, not partial effort, but sustained consistency, until the pattern no longer returns, until the resistance no longer controls, until the direction becomes stable. And this is where real change is confirmed. Not when things feel better, but when they remain different consistently. And once this happens, you step into a new level, not just of progress, but of understanding. Because now you know what caused the delay, what sustained the pattern, what broke the cycle. And this knowledge becomes strength, because you can now recognize it again. You can now respond earlier. You can now prevent it from returning. And this is where control shifts. Not external control, but internal authority. You are no longer reacting blindly. You are responding intentionally. You are no longer affected without awareness. You are engaging with clarity. And this is where everything changes. Because now, you are not just trying to move forward. You are maintaining your position while advancing. and that is powerful. Now we enter a phase that many people do not prepare for, the phase of recovery. Because it is one thing to break a pattern, it is another thing to reclaim what was affected by that pattern. And if you stop at breaking cycles without restoring what was lost, delayed, or diverted, you will experience partial victory. And partial victory often feels like progress, but still leaves gaps. You may feel lighter, but still behind. You may feel free, but still lacking. And this is where many people stop too early. They celebrate relief, but do not pursue restoration. They experience release, but do not enforce recovery. And this is why some people break out of struggle, but never fully step into abundance. Because recovery requires intention, not just awareness, but action. You must recognize what has been affected, not only in obvious ways, but in subtle ones. Time lost, opportunities missed, energy drained, confidence weakened. These things do not always announce themselves, but they leave impact. And if they are not addressed, they shape your future silently. This is why recovery must be deliberate. You must begin to ask, what has been delayed in my life? What has been consistently interrupted? What have I been unable to sustain? Because whatever answers these questions reveals what needs to be restored. And restoration is not passive. It does not happen by waiting. It happens through alignment and action. You begin to reposition yourself. You begin to re-engage with clarity. You begin to move forward intentionally. And this is where things begin to accelerate. Because once resistance weakens, movement increases. And what once took long begins to happen faster. But here is something important. Acceleration can be overwhelming if you are not prepared. Because when things begin to open, they may open quickly. Opportunities may appear suddenly. Decisions may become urgent. Responsibilities may increase. And if your foundation is not stable, you may mishandle the moment. You may hesitate. You may doubt. You may miss what you prayed for. This is why preparation matters. Not only for breaking cycles, but for handling what comes after. Because recovery brings responsibility. You must be ready to sustain what is restored. You must be ready to manage what is released. You must be ready to maintain what begins to grow. And this requires maturity. Not perfection, but readiness. You begin to operate differently. You no longer move casually. You no longer delay important decisions. You no longer ignore what matters. Because now you understand the cost of neglect. You have seen what delay can do. You have experienced what repetition feels like, and you are no longer willing to return there. This awareness sharpens you. It makes you more intentional. It makes you more focused. It makes you more disciplined. And this is what sustains recovery. But there is another layer. Because recovery is not only about receiving, it is also about releasing. You must let go of what belonged to the old cycle, old thinking, old responses, old attachments. Because you cannot carry them into a new season. They will slow you down. They will confuse your direction. They will recreate the same pattern. And this is why letting go is necessary. Not emotionally, but strategically. You choose what stays. You choose what goes. You choose what aligns with your direction. And over time, this creates clarity. You no longer feel divided. You no longer feel uncertain. You no longer feel pulled in different directions. You are focused, and focus creates speed, not rush movement, but efficient progress. You begin to move with direction. You begin to act with confidence. You begin to sustain momentum. And this is where recovery becomes visible, not just internally, But externally, things begin to shift. Opportunities begin to align. Progress begins to show. Not because everything is perfect, but because you are aligned. And alignment changes everything. But even here, there is still something that must be protected. Because recovery can attract pressure. New opportunities can attract distraction. New progress can attract resistance. And if you are not careful, you may lose what you just regained. This is why vigilance must continue, not fearfully, but wisely. You remain aware, you remain disciplined, you remain aligned, because consistency protects recovery. And this is where many people must grow, because it is not enough to receive. You must sustain, you must build, you must develop, and this leads to the next phase. Because once recovery begins, something else must follow. Expansion. There is a stage beyond recovery that many people never fully enter: expansion. Because it is one thing to get back what was delayed, it is another thing to move beyond where you were before. And if you stop at recovery, you may return to the same level you struggle at. But if you move into expansion, you step into something greater than your previous limitation. This is where growth becomes intentional, not survival, but advancement. Because now you are no longer trying to fix what is broken, you are building what is next. And this requires a different mindset. You cannot think the same way you thought before. You cannot operate with the same habits. You cannot approach life with the same level of awareness. Because expansion requires capacity. And capacity must be developed. You must think wider. You must see further. You must act with greater clarity. Because what is ahead of you requires more than what you used before. Now, this is where many people hesitate. Because expansion feels unfamiliar. It requires stepping beyond what is comfortable. It requires making decisions with greater responsibility. It requires trusting the process even when it stretches you. And if you are not prepared, you may shrink back to what feels safe. But what feels safe is often what kept you limited. This is why growth must be embraced, not forced, but accepted. Because you cannot expand while holding on to a mindset of limitation. You cannot move forward while thinking from a place of fear. You cannot build something new while operating from old patterns. Something must shift again. And this time, it is not about breaking or recovering. It is about building. You begin to build structure. You begin to build discipline. You begin to build consistency at a higher level. Because expansion without structure leads to collapse, and structure sustains growth. Now here is something deeper. Because expansion is not always comfortable. Sometimes it feels like pressure. Sometimes it feels like stretching. Sometimes it feels like responsibility increasing faster than expected. But this is part of the process. Because growth requires adjustment. You are becoming someone who can handle more. Not just receive more, but manage more. And this is where maturity is revealed. Not in what you receive, but in how you sustain it. Because many people desire increase, but are not prepared to maintain it. And what you cannot maintain, you will eventually lose. This is why preparation continues even after recovery. You develop habits that support your growth. You maintain awareness as your responsibilities increase. You stay aligned even as opportunities expand. And this creates stability at a higher level. Not just surviving, but advancing. But there is another challenge here. Because expansion attracts attention. Not always visible, but real. New levels bring new pressures. New opportunities bring new tests. New progress brings new forms of resistance. And if you assume everything will remain easy, you may be caught unprepared. This is why vigilance must evolve. Not only protecting what you recovered, but guarding what you are building. Because what you build must be protected, not out of fear, but out of responsibility. You begin to recognize distractions faster. You begin to filter what deserves your attention. You begin to prioritize what aligns with your direction. Because not everything that comes your way is meant to stay. And discernment becomes critical. You must know what to accept and what to reject. You must know what to pursue and what to ignore. You must know what strengthens your direction and what weakens it. And this clarity keeps your expansion stable. But here is the most important part, because expansion is not just external, it is internal. Your thinking expands, your awareness expands, your discipline expands. Because external growth without internal expansion creates imbalance, and imbalance leads to collapse. This is why internal development must continue. You refine your thinking, you strengthen your discipline, you deepen your awareness, and this allows you to sustain what is growing. Because growth without depth is fragile, but growth with depth is stable. And this stability allows you to continue advancing, not temporarily, but consistently. And this is where everything begins to align. Because now you are no longer breaking cycles, recovering losses. You are building forward with clarity, with structure, with intentionality. And this changes your trajectory. You are no longer reacting to life, you are shaping it. You are no longer limited by patterns, you are creating direction. You are no longer held back by delay, you are moving with purpose. And this is what expansion produces. But even here, one final truth must be understood. Because growth, recovery, and breakthrough must all be sustained. And that leads to the final stage. There is one final layer that determines everything you have built so far: sustainability. Because it is possible to become aware, to break patterns, to recover what was delayed, even to begin expanding and still lose it. Not because it was not real, but because it was not sustained. This is where many journeys quietly collapse. Not at the beginning, but after progress has already started. Because sustaining requires something deeper than effort. It requires structure. It requires discipline. It requires continuous alignment. And most importantly, it requires vigilance. Not fear-based vigilance, but intentional awareness. Because what you stop guarding, you slowly start losing. Not suddenly, but gradually. And gradual loss is dangerous because it is often unnoticed. You do not wake up one day and lose everything. You drift. Small compromises, subtle distractions, quiet neglect, and over time, what was once strong begins to weaken. This is why sustainability must be intentional, not something you assume, but something you build. You begin to protect your alignment daily. You maintain clarity in your thinking. You reinforce the habits that brought you forward. Because consistency is what stabilizes progress, not occasional effort, but repeated action. And this is where maturity is revealed. Not in how fast you move, but in how long you remain steady. Because longevity requires discipline, you must continue what works, even when it feels repetitive, even when it feels simple, even when it feels like nothing is changing, because repetition is what builds strength, and strength is what sustains progress. But here is something deeper, because sustainability is not just about maintaining what you have, it is about protecting who you have become. You are no longer the same person who was unaware. You are no longer the same person who tolerated patterns. You are no longer the same person who moved without clarity. You have changed, and that change must be protected, because identity determines behavior, and behavior determines outcome. If your identity remains aligned, your actions will follow. But if your identity becomes unstable, your actions will drift. This is why you must remain grounded, not in performance, but in truth, not in pressure, but in understanding. Because sustainability is not built on intensity, it is built on consistency. Now, this is where everything connects: awareness, alignment, strength, recovery, expansion. All of it leads to this: a life that is stable, not perfect, but steady. Not without challenges, but not controlled by them. Not without pressure, but not shaken by it. And this is the kind of life that continues to grow, because stability creates space for progress, and progress builds momentum, and momentum carries you forward. But here is the final truth you must hold on to, because none of this is sustained by human effort alone. Yes, discipline matters. Yes, awareness matters. Yes, consistency matters. But at the center of everything is dependence on God. Not passive dependence, but active relationship. Because without Him, clarity fades, strength weakens, discipline becomes exhausting, and progress becomes difficult to maintain. But with Him, there is sustaining grace. There is strength beyond your own. There is wisdom that guides your decisions. There is clarity that keeps you aligned. And this is what anchors everything. Because the goal is not just to move forward, it is to remain established. Not just to break free, but to stay free. Not just to grow, but to endure. And this is where true transformation is confirmed. Not in moments, but in consistency over time. So as you move forward from here, remember this: do not return to what you have outgrown. Do not ignore what you now understand. Do not relax where you should remain aware. Stay aligned. Stay disciplined. Stay watchful. Because your life is not random. Patterns are not meaningless. And progress is not automatic. But transformation is possible. Stability is attainable. And forward movement can be sustained. Let your life reflect not just what you escaped, but what you have become.